I feel like that guy from Your Dinosaurs Are Wrong, you know?
Do an impression.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this installment of Your Godzillas Are Wrong.
What's wrong with this one?
This one is obviously so wrong that it is not even a Godzilla. A lot of bird species have this thing called filial imprinting, when chick decides to treat some large-sized creature that it meets soon after hatching as its parent. More often than not, it really is the chick's mother, which is exactly why this mechanism evolved. However, filial imprinting works just as well on other birds of same or different species that just happen to be around at the right time, as well as it works on creatures that are not even birds, like for example Austrian zoologists. Why am I discussing that in a video about Godzilla, you might ask? Well, a funny thing happened to me. The very first Godzilla movie that I ever saw was this one, Roland Emmerich's 3-star Godzilla, also known as Zilla, and I absolutely loved it. I was in my teenage years back then, and the movie left me convinced that Godzilla is female, that she had mutated because of radiation from an iguana, that she looks like an oversized theropod with some ankylosaur sprinkled on the back, that she is awesome and hella realistic for a giant movie monster. At the time, I had absolutely no idea that this version of Godzilla is considered to be all wrong and is almost universally hated by the kaiju fans. It has even earned a nickname Chino, which stands for Godzilla in name only. So when I first saw the classic Godzilla design sometime later, I was like, well, that's just hilarious. Someone probably didn't properly read their dinosaur books. And it does what? Please stop, no animal can possibly breathe radiation. But that was all a couple of decades ago, and for a long time my mind was occupied with things other than Godzilla. Then, fairly recently, I've made a video about scientific plausibility of kaiju, and after that, one about King Kong. And then, it only seemed logical to go on with Godzilla, as well as subscribers kinda wanted it. And when I started researching for that, Zilla of my childhood suddenly didn't look so very realistic anymore, and neither did classic Godzilla look that ridiculous. But before we get to that, I propose we start with the origins and try to figure when, why, and how Godzilla appeared at all. The name itself apparently comes from the crossbreeding of the Japanese words gorira and kujira, which stand for gorilla and whale. If you watch a lot of anime, like I do, you might have noticed that Japanese have difficulties distinguishing English sounds for R and L. That's because in Japan there is only one sound, somewhat intermediate between these two, and they are kinda interchangeable. That means we could have ended up with Godzilla instead of Godzilla, but I guess translators decided that the latter kinda sounds more impressive and ominous. The original movie was produced and released in Japan in 1954 by Ishiro Honda. It is generally considered to be a metaphor for nuclear holocaust, a hypothetical event for which the Japanese supposedly had front-row seats at the time. It might at first seem weird that it took almost 10 years after Hiroshima and Nagasaki to finally make Godzilla, but if we take into account some additional factors, it gets much more understandable. For starters, post-war Japan was under American occupation up until 1952. It was a much softer version of what had happened to Germany. Japanese Emperor Hirohito was granted immunity from prosecution for the war crimes and actually stayed in power up until his death. As well as in general, Japanese maintained control over their civil administration institutions. However, there was still 1 million American soldiers on the Japanese grounds for 7 years, and during that, nuclear bombing-themed movies were just not happening. Godzilla was one of the first, but far from the only, attempt to reflect on that topic. And as well as the rest of these movies, it was only made after the occupation was over. It might be a bit of speculation on my side, but I suspect Godzilla might have been not just a blunt physical metaphor for the radioactive destruction, but also a metaphor for the destruction of Japanese sovereignty by some overwhelming force from the overseas. It's worth noting that it was the first, and as of now, the only time in the entire history of Japan when it got occupied by some foreign power, which, in the eyes of the Japanese, should have probably looked like a kaiju-sized disaster. Besides that, there was a much more immediate source of inspiration for Godzilla, the Daigo Fukuryumaru incident, which occurred in March of 1954, around the time when Godzilla's script was in production. Daigo Fukuryumaru is the name of a small fishing boat that was looking for tuna in the Pacific in the early spring of 1954. It just so happened that at the same time, nearby in the Pacific, on the Bikini Atoll, Americans were testing Castle Bravo, a thermonuclear weapon around 1,000 times more powerful than the bomb that devastated Hiroshima. Daigo Fukuryumaru got accidentally caught in the cloud of fallout. There were 23 fishermen on board, and all of them suffered from radiation sickness to at least some degree. And one of them, radio operator Aikichi Kuboyama, died as a direct result of that. Godzilla's opening scene is a direct reference to Daigo Fukuryumaru incident, as well as we can see that nod in a movie that I consider to be the most faithful reimagining of the original, Godzilla -1, released in 2023. There was a string of Godzilla sequels that followed the original movie, but they were all of kinda different genre. It's like Alien. First one was survival horror, second was action movie, third was David Fincher, who has not yet figured how to Seven and Fight Club. In the case of Godzilla, first one referenced events that scarred the entire nation, while the following ones were more of Big Lizard, Punch Big Monkey genre. Hollywood was not the first to do this. In basically every Japanese kaiju movie, starting with 1955, Godzilla had to fight some other kaiju, and it continued for quite a long time. The concept started to run out of steam a little bit, but then the American incarnations appeared. It was time to make Godzilla Japanese again, and that meant stepping back from Big Lizard Punch Big Monkey formula for a while, back to the roots, which brought us Shin Godzilla and Godzilla -1. Shin Godzilla was released in 2016 and was, among other things, a sort of reaction to the Fukushima disaster. It was not exactly a national tragedy movie, like the first Godzilla was, but it also certainly was not a Big Lizard Punch Big Monkey. Rather, it was more of a bureaucratic state versus walking natural disaster sort of movie. Shin Godzilla is also notable for being the third distinct type of Godzilla, together with the classic and Emmerich's incarnations. I feel like maybe some hardcore Godzilla fans will heavily disagree with me now, but in all the other Japanese movies except for Shin, as well as in all the American ones except for Zilla, we basically see the same creature, with slight variations in shape and up to double variations in size, sure, but the key elements don't change. It's Pterodon-type kaiju, a giant reptile that walks upright on its two hind legs, with tail dragging behind on the ground. It is semi-aquatic, it has some distinctly shaped scales on its back, and it occasionally demonstrates a very serious case of radioactive halitosis. So what's wrong and what's right about all that from a scientific perspective? Is it possible for real-life classic-type Godzilla to exist? Well, it belongs to Derivant kaiju subtype, which raises an obvious question. What exactly was Godzilla derived from, and how realistic can that be? One of the key sources of inspiration behind Godzilla is known to be The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, American science fiction action horror movie that came out in 1953 and featured a creature named Rhedosaurus. Rhedosaurus got marketed as a Derivant kaiju, a creature never seen before on screen, but I'd rather put it into the Gigamorph group. It's not really super original, it's basically a giant lizard. It looks like a tuatara that decided to unsprawl her legs a little bit in a dinosaur fashion, and while it's only around 12 meters high, its length reaches 60 meters, which places Rhedosaurus far beyond the limits defined by the real-life giants, like whales and sauropods. That means, if we rate plausibility based on size alone, Rhedosaurus fails just as badly as all the species of Godzilla. Godzilla, however, is not just a giant upward-walking Rhedosaurus. Godzilla is also a sort of embodiment of how peoples saw dinosaurs a century ago. One of the crucial changes that we made to the dinosaur reconstructions since then is their spine and tail position. The thing is, early paleontologists thought dinosaurs were slow and sluggish cold-blooded beasts that dragged their tails behind. And only fairly recently we figured that they actually were active, warm-blooded animals, and that their tailbones were interconnected with ligaments that kept them upright and horizontal, providing counterbalance for the body, not dragging behind. That, in essence, is one of the key differences between Zilla and the rest of Godzillas. Zilla is more like a modern reconstruction of dinosaur, and I am not so sure that it is a good thing for a creature of such size. If we compare Zilla to the biggest known animals that used that body plan, which would be either Tyrannosaurus rex or Spinosaurus, the difference is staggering. It's like 8 times longer. That means the burden of the square cube law should be serious, and what worked for T-Rex will not work for Zilla. The effectiveness of leg muscles and resistance of the bones are proportional to cross-sections, while the mass of the body that they should all counteract is proportional to the volume. Now, if the length is 8 times bigger, that means cross-sections will grow 64 times, while body volume and mass up to 512 times, and that essentially means that if Zilla wants to retain her ability to stand and walk, she would need legs 8 times thicker and bulkier than T-Rex proportionally has. Where have we seen this one? Well, that's actually close to what the classic Godzilla does. The classic Godzilla doesn't really move how theropods used to. It is kinda closer to sauropods in that dimension, and I consider that to be a reasonable and much more effective adaptation. Leg shape of the most of the terrestrial giants, regardless of their species, shifted towards reinforced columns of bone rather than flexible and agile raptor-type weapons. As a bonus, classic Godzilla also has its tail act as a third support column, which would make the body even more stable. It maybe didn't really work out for the first reconstructions of theropods, but it might be a viable approach for something as big as Godzilla. That means Zilla actually gets minus points for the anatomy, while classic Godzilla holds much more solid scientific ground. As for Shin Godzilla, in its final forms, it keeps general column shape maybe even better than the classic ones, but it also sports an unrealistically long and agile tail that sometimes towers above its head. In any case, Shin Godzilla still does better than Zilla here, who blatantly uses late 90s CGI for breaking bunch of laws of physics to look way slimmer than she has any rights to. But shape and physique is not all there is to Godzilla. Arguably, even more important is that other aspect of the big lizard, the radiation. In almost all versions of Godzilla, it gets either created or awakened by radiation. It brings radiation around, it sometimes feeds on radiation, and it can breathe radiation on us mortals when it's angry or in pain. Unlike her other relatives, Zilla does not consume or breathe radiation. She has this car-exploding blow skill. Some theorized that she might have methane stored in the guts from all the fish she consumes, and that might actually work, I guess. Also, Zilla generally consumes fish, which is a sound strategy for a giant reptile. Some of the biggest creatures on our planet feed on some tiny fish, squid, or krill. That gets Zilla a bonus point in metabolism, while classic Godzilla and Shin Godzilla leave us with question. Is that possible for a living creature to not only survive, but also thrive in the presence of radiation, as well as feed on it, as well as use it as a weapon? The answer is, maybe? Some would mention tardigrades. Those sturdy little guys can sure adapt to many harsh environments like heat, cold, vacuum, and the radiation. However, they obtain most of their resistances only in the desiccated cryptobiosis state, after losing all body water and putting on halt all and any metabolic activity, kinda like playing dead for real. Tardigrades are more or less resistant to radiation in their active state as well, but they certainly do not benefit from it or feed on it. There is another known candidate for the job, however, the radiotrophic fungi, which possibly exist in Chernobyl. There was a certain species of fungus which grew towards the source of radiation, not away from it. That fungus turned out to be very rich in melanin, which is apparently how they shield themselves from radiation. However, surviving radiation does not yet mean feeding on it. And as of yet, it has not been convincingly proven that fungi can feed on ionizing radiation, in the same way as, say, plants photosynthesize in the light. It might be that these Chernobyl fungi just used their radiation resistance to feed on what was left of less fortunate bacteria and algae. Or maybe there was some other reason. Anyway, true radiosynthesis or radiotrophy is as of now not indeed the clearly proven diamond tier, but something much lower. Why is that, you might ask? Well, then we need to have a quick look into how ionizing radiation works and why it is so damn harmful. In general, from the point of view of a human organism, radiation is like a shotgun charge with microscopic pellets, smaller than nuclei of most atoms. There are several different types. Alpha radiation is the worst in terms of ionization ability, and gamma radiation is the most dangerous at penetration. If radiation damages cell walls or abundant organelles like ribosomes, it's harmful but tolerable and survivable. The worst happens when these atomic bullets hit our DNA, the memory and the blueprint of our cells, organs, and entire bodies. Gamma radiation can rip the DNA string apart, which might later lead to incorrect repairs with harmful mutation. DNA, however, is not that vulnerable to such a commotion most of the time, because it doesn't usually float around the nucleus as a string. While DNA is not in use, it gets rolled down on proteins called histones, like on the little spools, and these particles, called nucleosomes, get themselves folded into a higher level structure called chromatin, and the chromatin makes up what we see in the microscope as the chromosomes. When is DNA unrolled from these spools and vulnerable to radiation? Well, that would generally be in two cases. It's either when the cell is actively working on producing new proteins, or when it is dividing into two new cells. Human organs that do that and are most vulnerable to radiation are bone marrow, genitals, inner secretion glands, and almost all of the digestive tract. The same is true not just for peoples, but for the most other vertebrate species as well, including reptiles. Radiation kills all the organics that produce and reproduce, and that severely limits how animals can interact with it on cellular level. As fungi have shown, you can shield yourself from radiation, but the organs that do the feeding and thus should be unshielded are unfortunately those with the most unrolled and vulnerable DNA. One might make a series of conjectures that some true radiotrophic fungi exist after all, and that they somehow got into symbiosis with a giant lizard and the giant lizard would probably prefer to keep them away from the rest of the organism, like for example in giant keratinized scales on the back. That's actually a smart move. But despite even that, giant lizard is a giant lizard. It's vertebrate, and it will quickly die from intestinal, lymphatic, or endocrine cancer if it really consumes radioactive matter on a regular basis and leaves a Geiger-clicking contaminated trail behind. In other words, radioactive metabolism, radiation breathing, and feeding on radiation all fall into the weaker side of sci-fi, which leaves classic and Shin Godzillas with minuses in the physiology category. But hey, radiation is not absolutely always that terrible. In a miraculously rare percent of cases, it causes some mutation that is actually good, in the only single cell where it really matters, in the reproductive cell that gets to start a new organism. While it is highly improbable, it is at least remotely possible for, say, iguana or salamander eggs to get a mutation that breaks a cap on growth size. These critters, however, will also need mutations for sturdier bones, more efficient muscles, recalibrated circulatory, immune, endocrine, and nervous systems, and many other crucial mutations, which a single organism would be unbelievably lucky to receive by accident all at once. While that is improbable to an astronomical degree, that's still better than the other origin story. A creature that naturally evolved on Earth and got either awakened from geological slumber or enhanced by the radiation exposure. Why is that option unplausible? Well, first of all, nobody survives geological periods of time in any other way except for becoming a fossil. Then there is generally no reason why would any reptile need to evolve that big. And even if it did, how the hell did it survive KPG extinction that indiscriminately destroyed everything bigger than a pigeon? How the hell does it survive in general, being just a single representative of its species? So, at the end of the day, all the radiation-mutated Godzillas, as well as all the ancient natural and ancient radiation-enhanced varieties, fail in the origin category. And that includes most of the classic Godzillas, as well as Zilla. However, not the Shin Godzilla. If you are unfamiliar with the movie, you might have been asking, why is Shin Godzilla in a separate category at all? It's distinct, but overall just another variation on the classic phenotype. And yet, Shin Godzilla demonstrates something curious and entirely new. A life cycle with series of metamorphoses, somewhat similar to how frogs go through the tadpole stage. All the vertebrates actually do that, it's just that most finish it inside an egg or a womb before getting out into the brave new world. On its first appearance, Shin Godzilla actually reminds a giant tadpole, and further in the movie it demonstrates how flawed and incomplete its gigantism and radiation mutations are. The creature obviously suffers, it vomits blood and generally looks disoriented, it looks lost, and when it attacks it seems to be more of chaotic hysteria type reaction rather than intelligent anger. As I've said, mutation from radiation is highly improbable, but Shin Godzilla does at least try to depict it realistically imperfect, for which I'll leave its points at 0 here. What Shin Godzilla gets extra point for is its behavior. It apparently has intelligence comparable to that of a sponge. Just look into its creepy, lifeless eyes. And I would say it is probably the most scientifically plausible depiction of behavior of a creature that has grown into a way bigger size than nature intended it to. Even in the best-case scenario, radiation-mutated Godzilla brain must remind a cauliflower of neural cell tumors, and should not be very good at its job. One might argue that Zilla also holds well in terms of behavior. At the end of the day, throughout the movie, she just feeds, looks for a place to breed, and cares for her young. However, traveling across half of the globe to lay a clutch of eggs in the middle of Manhattan sounds like, like a bird flying to another continent to make a nest on the biggest anthill for some reason. That is too risky, very impractical, and highly improbable. Then again, maybe it's just some genetically crippled reproduction behavior pattern misfiring, in the same way as in Shin Godzilla we see misfiring development and metabolism. But we also get sufficient proof that young Zillas can successfully hunt unarmed humans, so maybe the Manhattan Nest project was not such a bad idea after all. Yeah, I guess Zilla gets a bonus point for behavior as well. The one that doesn't is the classic Godzilla, that is, all the other Americans except Zilla and all the Japanese except for Shin. Whether it is an ancient protector or an evil monster that for some reason consciously attacks and destroys human buildings and vehicles, or some point in between these two, I find it highly improbable for any kaiju to demonstrate such advanced, complicated, and incredibly dumb behavior. The concept of an ancient protector of the Earth as a whole doesn't make any sense, and if you think otherwise, I would highly recommend you to try reading Selfish Gene. And animal attacking humans for the sheer purpose of destruction is just downright against logic. Any animal, regardless of size, would choose to avoid confrontation with the large conglomerations of humans and their tech, and would probably run away at the very moment they get first shot at. So that leaves us with -3 score for Classic Godzilla, -1 for Shin Godzilla, no irony or pun intended, and -1 for Zilla. Again, no pun intended, seriously. It is curious to check out how Rhedosaurus holds in that competition. We have already noted that its size is as unrealistic as that of the rest of Godzillas. But it has semi-sprawling quadruped posture, and while realistically its limbs should be more like those of sauropods, straight and column-like, still it has 4 of them, which improves weight distribution, so Rhedosaurus earns at least 0 points here. If we speak physiology, it has a deadly ability to spread some prehistoric disease, and while it is not very common for infections to hop from reptiles to mammals, it is not unheard of, as well as it is very believable that humans would have no natural immunity against it, just like Native Americans had no resistance to plagues that Europeans brought upon them. Then Rhedosaurus also spreads radiation, but only because it got caught in fallout of human-made nuclear weapons. It has a diet of an active carnivore, and it acts like an animal. I mean, it generally feeds and looks for a mate, and that's it. The only other aspect where Rhedosaurus really falls short is its origin. It is known to have survived frozen since the Mesozoic times. Someday I will make an episode about sci-fi hardness of cryogenic coma, but for now, in short, it is kinda really improbable. So Rhedosaurus gets a minus here, but still does better than any of Godzilla's overall, up to 0 points. If we place them all on my sci-fi hardness tier list, using the lowest score of classic Godzilla as an anchor for the cake tier and going in steps of 1 point up, we get that! Rhedosaurus rises up to aluminum tier mediocre sci-fi, while Shin Godzilla as well as Zilla manage to break into real science fiction category. The weakest possible kind of it, but still, I consider that to be an achievement for 50-meter or more kaiju. Am I maybe biased to Zilla here, because she was my first and favorite? Well, I am biased in that way, yes, but in the same way as Zilla was a hallmark big lizard for me, the Shin Godzilla was the only one that gave me genuine chills. With that devastating nuclear breath scene, I literally felt the hair all over my body rise in awe and horror. On the other hand, Godzilla -1, my favorite of the classic Godzillas, made me see how kaiju movies can handle grave human drama on a level comparable to masterpieces like Parasites or Handmaiden. So I'm kinda biased to the classic Godzilla as well. So I guess if I'm biased towards all three, that kinda makes me more or less unbiased. Also, speaking of classic basic Godzilla type, I didn't really study every single detail of all the species I so haphazardly included into that taxon. And I suppose that maybe one or two of distinct subspecies of these might score Vox tier, or possibly even Rubber tier. If you have an idea which exactly these might be, please tell me in the comments. While Rhedosaurus was the first, and Godzilla the most popular of the kaiju lizards, they are certainly not the only ones known to humanity. Of all the other overgrown fictional reptiles, the most notable two are probably Anguirus and Gamera. Both trace their roots to the Japanese rubber suit era, and I propose we add them both to our tier list as well. Gamera, the giant turtle, is just as impossibly big as Godzilla, and while it also shares a somewhat similar stable upright posture, it leans dangerously forward, and it does so while having a heavy carapace, which leaves her with 0 points for anatomy at best. Then, while Gamera is not radioactive, it has another metabolic issue. It is known to feed on heat and other sources of energy, as well as breathe them out, in the same way as Godzilla does with radiation. More than that, Gamera is also known to fly via jet propulsion. I'm not kidding, check this out. To be fair, classic Godzilla was also observed to do that, but in one of her movies only, while Gamera flies on a regular basis in almost every movie she's in. So that's minus for physiology, as well as there's minus for origins. Like Godzilla, Gamera is an ancient creature that somehow mysteriously survived to this day. And finally, it also shares the same behavioral issues. It is an ancient protector of the Earth in general, and for some reason of little human children's in particular. So all in all, Gamera turns out to be even more impossible than the classic Godzilla, and should go to some even lower tier, which I do not even have. So what's softer than cake? Let's call it cotton candy tier, I guess. Anguirus is comparable to Godzilla and Gamera in size, as well as it is another miraculously preserved living fossil, presumably of some ankylosaurid. Anguirus also fails in behavior realism. It teams up with some kaiju and fights to death with others for no apparent reason, which regular animals don't really do. However, it is primarily quadruped, and while it has the same issues with leg shape and position as Rhedosaurus, it gets at the very least 0 points in anatomy. As of physiology, we never really learn what exactly does Anguirus eat, but at the very least it is not known to consume or produce radiation or some other kind of energy, so it gets 0 points here as well. Altogether, that makes a score of -3 points, so Anguirus joins Godzilla in the cake tier. While these three iconic kaiju share ultra-low scientific plausibility tier, I'd say classic Godzilla really stands out in terms of cultural significance. At the end of the day, the same exact feature that sinks Godzilla's sci-fi hardness rating is the one that made her so frightening and memorable in the first place: the radiation. Radiation, as a kaiju-shaped threat, is certainly a cinematic symbol, a reminder that we, as a civilization, need to have, even at the expense of a cake-tier scientific plausibility. It does not necessarily has to be so, however, as proven by Shin Godzilla, which manages to be harder sci-fi than the classic original while still staying radioactive and recognizably Godzilla-shaped. Zilla, on the other hand, demonstrates that the increase in scientific plausibility does not necessarily make you cool and popular. It's also kind of funny that we haven't had any giant lizard movies that would be harder than the very first one from 1953, and the glorious Grandpa Rhedosaurus still holds the title of the most plausible of his kind. Hopefully, we'll get some in the future. I'd certainly love to see one. Make Rhedosaurus cool again! On the other hand, I would also love to see the next radiation awareness classic Godzilla cake tier movie, which, if it wants to stay faithful to the global threat trends, this time will probably arise from either harsh wilderness of Siberia or the northern part of the Korean peninsula. Speaking more of the futures and videos, Hardcore Sci-Fi channel has recently grown over 1000 subscribers, because of which I held a voting for you guys to pick a topic for my next video. Godzilla came up on top with more than 30% of the votes, which is why I made this video and why you can now watch it. And well, I'd like to learn more about what you guys would like to see on this channel, so I propose you to share ideas in the comments, as well as like other people's ideas that you would like to see the most, and then I'll see what out of the top 6 most liked options I can practically make, say for the day when the channel grows over 10,000. So this must be the part where I say leave a like and subscribe, stay hardcore and see you in the next video, but there is still one more thing. You see, after Godzilla won the voting contest, I made a little post where I asked you guys if there are maybe any experts on Godzilla among you, and what is your opinion on the most realistic Godzilla of them all. And when the script was already finished, I noticed that quite a bunch of people pointed out to the same thing I haven't yet seen: Godzilla singular point anime, with the so-called Godzilla Ultima, and it sounded really promising. Small Godzilla, a lot of science homework done for the script, written by a physics professor. And well, yeah, it really feels like it was written by a physics professor. More than 50% of anime is a lecture on speculative physics, which characters tell to each other. I've watched it all, and I can put Godzilla Ultima on the tier list now. It certainly deserves to be separated from the classic Godzilla branch and placed into a separate taxon, possibly related to Shin Godzilla, since it also goes through series of transformations. So let's go through our list of traits, starting with the size, of which Ultima reaches up to 100 meters in its final form. Sure, it starts much more humble-sized, but when all the transformations are over, it is just as impossibly enormous as legendary or Shin Godzilla's. Its anatomy is close to classic Godzilla in its final terrestrial form, with reinforced bulky legs for additional support, which I approve. Besides, it is almost mosasaur-shaped in the beginning, when it is confined to water, so it certainly gets bonus point for anatomy. As for physiology, Ultima does not appear to be radioactive, but it has another metabolism issue altogether. The thing is, Godzilla Ultima appears because of and brings along with it some substance known as the red dust. What is that red dust, you might ask? Oh well, it's just one of the possible projections of the archetype in our regular three-dimensional space. What is the archetype, you might ask then? Well, if you existed in the world of singular point anime, at that point, you would surely receive at least 3 minutes of lecture on highly speculative interdimensional physics, at the end of which you would have even more questions, like, for example, what exactly is orthogonal diagonalizer? But here we are on the Hardcore Sci-Fi channel, and my answer would be: archetype is a variety of unobtainium, on which I have done a couple of videos before. I've made up some basic taxonomy system there, so let's have a look how does the archetype fit into that. Archetype surely belongs to the Mysterium class, since a lot about it stays unknown throughout the series. Then it also belongs to the Transportalium class, because it kinda exists on some higher dimension and can twist and mess the spacetime as we know it. It is also a sort of energium, since it contains a lot of mysterious energy that manifests in all sorts of ways. As well as it is destructium, given the chaos that it wreaks on human infrastructure and the catastrophic potential of its singular point form. Archetype also counts as antagonium of sorts. Its red dust form is known to be effectively antagonized by its blue crystal form. Archetype is also mutatium because of its ability to create and change living organisms, and it might as well count as handwavium given all its other miraculous properties. While some of the mentioned unobtainium types might be very plausible, others are not. But in the case of archetype, it doesn't even matter that much, because it just has too many of them. It belongs to the 7 different types of unobtainium out of 12, while the known real-life unobtainiums never have more than 3. It makes other unobtainiums look like your regular accessible materials. I mean, archetype is the unobtainium even in the world of unobtainiums. Archetype relies heavily on string theory, which has not yet been proven and thus should be probably called string hypothesis. It has some elaborate math and a promise to finally unite gravity and quantum physics, but no experimental data has been gathered yet to prove any of the predictions string hypothesis makes. So at the end of the day, it might turn out to be just some fancy math with no connection to reality. Given all that, archetype goes to cake tier, and Godzilla Ultima, as an archetype-based life form, gets minus points in metabolism and origin categories. As for behavior, well, it is actually animalistically realistic to a certain degree. Godzilla Ultima is not posed as an ancient protector or an evil monster here. Rather, it for some reason moves into the city and then mostly acts in self-defense. It is hard to make any reliable estimates of what would be a scientifically plausible behavior for an interdimensional life form, so I'll just put 0 points here, which leaves us with total score of -2, and places Godzilla Ultima into the Vox tier of science fantasy. That means, while it is not as hard as Shin or Zilla, Godzilla Ultima is certainly harder than the classic. Also, that Vox tier rating only goes to Godzilla Ultima personally, not the whole anime, since Singular Point also offers us mecha, time travel, future prediction, AI, supercomputers, and a lot of other stuff. And some of it looks like much harder sci-fi than Godzilla Ultima itself. So, I guess now that is finally all I have to say on scientific plausibility of Godzilla. If you are a hardcore Godzilla fan and either think that I'm terribly wrong in my judgment or have any better ideas of what other giant lizards can be even harder sci-fi than Rhedosaurus, I am very curious to read about it in the comments. If you liked this video, leave a like, and if you'd like to see more like it, subscribe. That is scientifically proven to work. Thanks for watching, stay hardcore, and see you in the next video.